So today we're going to discuss the history and some of the characteristics of Vajrayana Buddhism, a very interesting and complicated kind of topic, coming right up. So I'm Doug Smith, I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association, that's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled life, consider subscribing to the channel. So Vajrayana Buddhism. It's a huge topic and not one that I can do anything more than sketch out in today's video. But it's something that's very complicated and I don't think well understood, even today in the West, by most people. And so it's something worth discussing. It's, of course, very important to Tibetan Buddhist practice. It's very aesthetically based in the sense that there's a lot of artwork that comes out of Vajrayana belief and practice. So if we go to see Buddhist art, a lot of the times what we'll be seeing is material that comes out of this practice. It's also very controversial. It's very some of the practices are considered dangerous even by their practitioners, and it's considered a secret teaching in some ways. Mostly because certain of the practices are transgressive in many respects, and so I'm going to try to get into that today. We'll begin by giving a very quick overview of the history of it, looking at how it developed historically. Then we'll look at some of the differences that it has from other practices, in particular Mahayana and early Buddhism. Again, just a sketch. And then finally we'll look at what are some of the characteristics of Vajrayana belief and practice. So Vajrayana belief and practice arose out of what's called tantras. Tantra is a very difficult term to translate. I'll leave it untranslated for now. It'll become clear what exactly we're talking about as I discuss it. But basically these are kind of magical practices, what were believed to be magical practices, originally associated with the god Shiva, which is a Hindu deity that arose in the early centuries of the Common Era. And these are called Shaiva tantras, Shaiva being the adjectival form of Shiva. So they're tantras associated with the god Shiva. And these are basically what's called empowerments, magical ritual empowerments. The rituals, you undergo a ritual to give yourself the power of the deity, of the god Shiva in this case. And they use certain techniques that are considered transgressive, which we'll get into later on. And these tantric traditions involving, in particular, the gods Shiva and the Goddess Devī and others, tantric practices, arose in the Gupta dynasty during the 4th to the 6th centuries of the Common Era. That's where we find them really arising. And what we have at this time of in India, is a kind of a feudal structure to society. You have very powerful kings, rulers, lording it over groups of their vassals. And a lot of instability as well, a lot of infighting. And the scholar Ronald Davidson has talked about this, in particular in the 7th century in India, as being sort of a very key part of the arising of these kinds of tantric beliefs. And the tantric beliefs, often in Buddhist practice, which is what we're going to be discussing here, involve what's called a mandala. And a mandala, you may have seen them, they're often depicted in paintings or drawings as a sort of a circular figure, often, or a square figure, and at the center of it is a deity or a Buddha, and surrounded by its group of retainers, or of lesser Buddhas or lesser beings. And this, in Ronald Davidson's view, is basically a kind of a ritualized depiction of a kind of a feudal socio-political hierarchy. And Tantrism basically understands the world in this kind of feudal structure, where you have powerful individuals, either gods or Buddhas or whoever, who are performing certain kinds of ritual empowerments, or they're giving power to their vassals, who in return pledge allegiance to the god or whoever it might be who's in control. And so in these tantric practices, one basically ends up identifying oneself with the king or with the god, with the deity. If it was a Shaiva Tantra practice, you would identify yourself with Shiva, and thereby gain power through Shiva. And so the mandala is a kind of what we might call a performative space, in which we get to both worship the king or worship the god, and then play God or take the place of God by by performing him and getting certain powers through him, and then through what we might call a kind of ritual possession by the deity. That is the kind of thing that we find in Shaiva Tantra and Shiva Tantra that was taken over then into Buddhist practice. So these Hindu practices, the Shaiva Tantra that I've discussed, began to be very important within the 7th century of the Common Era, and they began to dominate the Buddhist practices at the time. And so what we find is that in order to survive, perhaps, or in order to gain royal patronage, Buddhist teachers began to take over a lot of these practices themselves. It seems like these are kind of practices that feudal lords rather liked, because one was then putting oneself in the position of the lord. It was something that seemed to magnify perhaps his own power, his own sense of power, or the feudal lord himself could practice what were considered magical practices, frankly, by allying himself with powers greater than himself, for example, gods or Buddhas. So then the Buddhist practices, given the 7th century problem of these Hindu practices dominating, the Buddhist practices then began to also take over in that same period, and by the 8th century were really quite powerful themselves. In other words, the Buddhist practices had really crystallized. Although apparently iconography, the sort of age of great iconography in this tradition, didn't begin until the 9th or 10th century, and the heyday of this kind of tantric practice within Buddhism is perhaps the 9th to the 12th century of the Common Era. So we have to understand that we're talking a good 1,500 years after the death of the historical Buddha. So quite late as far as history goes. And in the early part of this, we're really just talking about what we might term Tantra, tantric practices. But between the sort of 7th and 9th century, these tantric practices within Buddhism, again, begin to crystallize, and there begins to be a sort of a self-awareness of them as separate. And we begin to get the arising of the term Vajrayāna as something separate from the early Buddhism of, let's call it, what would have been called the Hinayana and the Mahayana. The Vajrayāna, being the third, was seen as a particularly effective way to gain Buddhahood, to gain the final goal, to become a Buddha oneself. It had begun to be seen by certain groups within the Sanghas as more effective than traditional kinds of teachings, than traditional kinds of practices, because it involved very powerful, very transgressive, very difficult kinds of practices. It involved what we might call forms of magic, or what were viewed as forms of magic. So now let's get into some of the differences that we find between this Vajrayana practice and what went before. In the first place, what went before, if you were an accomplished person within early Buddhism, you were considered an arahant. Arahant was somebody who had destroyed greed, hatred, and ignorance and was not going to be reborn. In the Mahayana, the goal was to become a complete Buddha, a perfected Buddha. But for most people, the goal, at least for the foreseeable future, was to be a bodhisattva, somebody who had pledged, who had vowed to save all sentient beings. And so those were the goals within Mahayana, either a bodhisattva for now or a Buddha at the final end. Within Vajrayana, there came to be the term siddha, who was a perfected one, as somebody who had gained that kind of goal as well. So it's a separate word used for them. Also, the earlier goal within Buddhism was seen as somewhat of a solitary path. In other words, one was supposed to, one could only really work on oneself through meditation. Of course, one was in a sangha for the most part if you were doing this kind of practice. So it wasn't like you were completely alone. But the idea was that you were supposed to be working on your own difficulties, your own unskillful mental states, through ethical practice, through meditation, and eventually by gaining wisdom. However, in tantric practice, in Vajrayana practice, your practice really was at least understood psychologically as taking place in a space where you are together with a lot of people, and your practice is made possible, or its success is made possible, by the intervention of beings greater than yourself. You worship these great Buddhas, these great bodhisattvas, and they in turn sort of consecrate you. They provide you power through magical means that you would not have been able to find out, would not have been able to discover by yourself, or that would have taken you uncounted numbers of lifetimes to discover by yourself. If we remember my earlier talk on Mahayana, what we find in the history of Mahayana is this kind of notion that the Buddha, who began as a human, has become sort of deified over time. And so by the time of the Vajrayana, the Buddha is so great, or so much greater than we are, that the idea of becoming a Buddha became such an enormous task that I think a lot of people probably despaired of it within their own lifetime or within an infinite number of lifetimes. And so it became necessary for a certain group of practitioners to essentially look to those great beings to provide magically the ability to be who they were. So there were a number of tantric rituals in order to summon these Buddhas, in order to learn from them, and also sort of ritual consecrations in order to basically have them possess one so that one could learn by direct experience, as it were, through the eyes of a Buddha, by essentially putting oneself in their place. In other words, by undergoing a ritual identification with the Buddha, one then could gain direct insight into reality that one could not gain for oneself without having done that kind of identification. The earlier path was also based on celibacy and nonviolence, so that one had to become a celibate in order to be in the monastery. One had to pledge not to be violent to be in the monastery. But what we find with these tantric practices is that there arose certain practices that sort of contravened these notions. That is, the tantric path was a transgressive path, where you have ritualized sexual activity and ritualized violence on behalf of the attainment of awakening. And we can now understand how that would have been considered very dangerous at the time, and certainly within a monastic context, and why it might have had to be kept secret. And as far as ritualized violence goes, I'll get to the sexuality in a bit. As far as ritualized violence goes, there's the Chakrasamvara myth, where Buddhas or Buddhist deities come and ritually kill Shiva in a sort of a ceremonial kind of procedure, where Shiva is killed and then revived as a kind of a demonic devotee of the Buddha. And this is, of course, ritualized in order to, shall we say, depower him as a Hindu deity and recover him as a Buddhist deity. But this kind of notion of violence on behalf of the Sangha is then also used in one's own practice. Some of the tantric practices are supposed to be using anger and hatred against one's own negative impulses as a sort of a dangerous, very powerful technique to uproot one's own difficult impulses. There's also something of a leveling of the lay and monastic distinction, which is something we've seen in a number of places in the history of Buddhism over the centuries. And in this case, it's almost, one might even say, an overturning of that distinction. Because once we get into transgressive sexual practices, we can understand that there would be many who would say monastics simply can't do those practices because they're supposed to be celibate. And so we have Atisha in the Bodhipata Pradipa, which is one of these tantric texts, basically saying that the sexual practices could not have been done by monastics and had to be done by lay people. But this introduces a possibility that lay people could actually end up being more accomplished practitioners of this kind of tantra than even monastics could. And in fact, we do see that was probably an issue within the Sangha, because we see a number of other texts where monastics are denigrated for looking to lay people for teaching. So presumably we did have an experience where monastics, wanting to know these sexual teachings but not being able to do them themselves, would go to lay people for instruction in some sense. Of course, this was then looked down upon by other monastics because monastics were supposed to be on a higher plane of study than laypersons. So we see there are a number of very, very important distinctions between tantric practices in the Vajrayana and other practices within Mahayana and earlier Buddhism. Now I'd like to go and discuss 7 of what I would say are characteristics of Vajrayana practice, or this kind of tantric practice. And there are various lists of these that we'll see from time to time if we read about these. It's difficult to give a complete overview picture because there's such a variety of tantric practices, and I don't claim to have a complete understanding of all of them either. But I think these 7 will at least give a generalized picture. The first of these characteristics is that Vajrayana practice is esoteric. That is to say, it's supposed to be kept secret. because it is transgressive, because it is considered dangerous, the same way we keep, let's say, national security issues secret, the way to create a nuclear weapon we keep secret, these practices were considered dangerous, so they were also kept secret and believed to be kept secret, that they should be. The texts that describe them often use heavily metaphorical imagery that needs unpacking in order to understand correctly. And that's part of keeping it secret. It's almost like a secret code, where a person who was not an initiate reading the text would not necessarily understand anything about it or anything important about it. But the initiate, once they have been taught how to understand the text, then understands the secrets behind it. And this is, of course, quite different from, let's say, early Buddhism, where in the final sutta before the Buddha died, it's written that he said that he always taught with an open hand, that he didn't keep anything secret. Here we find secrets are really the most important and deep of the teachings. And the second characteristic is the role of this teacher, of what's called the Vajra master, or Vajracharya, who is the person who initiates one into these kinds of rituals, who introduces one to the relevant deities or Buddhas, who is the sort of conduit for these kinds of empowerment ceremonies. And this role of the Vajra master, it seems to be something that was taken over from Hindu practice, where you would again have a kind of a master, a Brahminic master, who would initiate the introduction to with a new person to the god Shiva. Here, the Vajra master is the person who introduces the initiate to the Buddhas, or whoever it might be, the deities, the relevant deities, who then empower the initiate. And this is emphasized within these teachings as absolutely essential. That is, that you need a teacher. You can't do this on your own. You can't simply read the texts on your own and understand them. You don't have the power, let's say, to summon these deities or these Buddhas. They're not simply going to follow you, they're going to follow the Vajra master. The Vajra master is, in other words, inhabited with a certain power which is not existent in normal people. And this is, of course, a new development within Buddhism. And it also changed, to a degree, the moral code that one finds within Tantric practice. There arose the idea that the worst karmic action that you could take was to disparage your teacher. And as a result, you have this hierarchy then established in the moral code. And I think we can all see that there would be potential problems for abuse within this kind of situation, where you were not allowed morally to denigrate your teacher for any reason. The third characteristic of this kind of Vajrayana practice is the use of mandalas, again, as these kind of sacred spaces, as these kind of performative spaces in which these empowerments take place, where one puts oneself in the position of the central deity and visualizes the surrounding vassals or vassal deities or vassal Buddhas and their relationship to one. And by doing that, one then takes on the powers of this Buddha. And many of these empowerment rituals involved transgressive techniques and transgressive objects, fluids, foods. And this is, I would say, the fourth characteristic of Tantra or Tantric practice or Vajrayana practice. That is, these transgressive practices around impurities used within rituals, in particular both sexual acts and also sexual fluids that were ingested. They would also drink alcohol. There was even the suggestion of cannibalism, even a suggestion of ritual murder. Clearly these were positioned as very powerful and potentially dangerous kinds of practices. And it was supposed, this was all based on a kind of a philosophy, a background philosophy of non-dualism. That is to say that since our general ideas of the world, our concepts, were all radically deficient in many respects, we had to see the world in non-dual terms, that there's no real distinction between any two concepts we might have that are in opposition. So that there's no real distinction between good and evil. There's no real distinction between pure and impure. And so, insofar as we see these distinctions, we're only seeing the conventional reality and we're not seeing the ultimate reality. However, I must say that, of course, the way of understanding the character of non-duality in this context depended upon the practitioner and the teacher. Some, of course, would not have allowed for ritual murder, for example, and that these ideas of ritual murder or perhaps of cannibalism would have been taken, or even the sexual practices often were taken as metaphors. So they were simply used as metaphors within the practice, but just very powerful metaphors. It seems as though for other teachers they were taken literally. I'm not sure, up and including murder, that may not be the case, but certainly the sexual practices were not always taken as metaphorical, as we've seen, because there was a real problem with monastics actually undertaking the practices. I should say that within the West, Tantra is often understood as sort of a spiritualization of sex, a spiritualization of sexual activity, as a sort of a positive sexual practice. And that's not the way it was understood within the original teachings. In the original teachings, these were understood to be transgressive practices, very powerful kinds of magical practices. And the magic, the strong magic that one gained from the practice, came because these were viewed as impure. The substances used were viewed as impure, the actions were viewed as impure, and as a result, indulging in them in the right mental state was something that actually could provide one power. And just as some teachers would have viewed these practices as simply metaphors and not to be taken literally, it was also the case that certain teachers also said that you could indulge in these kinds of activities. In particular, even monastics could indulge in sex if they had the right mindset. If they had a mindset of emptiness, that they understood the emptiness of all things, then presumably, at least some teachers said, they wouldn't have any problem having sex because they would understand its ultimate empty nature. But we can also understand, once again, the room for abuse. When we take upon ourselves the idea that certain masters, certain teachers, can indulge in certain kinds of ritualized sexual activity with, let's say, their initiates or other people, we can understand how that might be ripe for abuse. Initiates might feel pressured to do certain things they might not want to. If they were not allowed to criticize their master, certain things might have happened. I'm not saying that they necessarily did in all cases. I'm simply saying that this is a possibility. The fifth of these characteristics of Tantra, which we haven't discussed a whole lot, but is related to the last, is this kind of revaluation of the body as positive, as a positive field for investigation, in particular within the realm of sense pleasures and sexual pleasures in particular. To that end, there are also a number of ideas that seem to have come either from Hinduism or from China, Chinese Taoism, in particular ideas of chakras, of energy channels, and of sort of using these kinds of subtle energies, what were considered subtle energies of the body, for ritual purposes. And this is something, again, one did not find in early Buddhism. One doesn't find discussions of chakras or energy channels in the body in early Buddhism. But this comes up in the context of these Vajrayana or Tantric practices. The sixth characteristic of Vajrayana practice is this revalue, just as we, in the prior when I said that they revalued the body as positive in certain respects, they also revalued problematic mental states as positive, in particular as instrumental in attaining awakening. Whereas in the early texts, one was really supposed to uproot greed and hatred, or in particular sexual desire, because as a monastic you were not supposed to indulge in that, and hatred as well. In these tantric practices, sexual desire became a route towards awakening. Certain kinds of mental states of anger or hatred could become routes to awakening if they're used in order to uproot the bad parts of ourselves. And in some of the texts, certain of the texts, awakening is even compared to sexual bliss, which of course in the context of the early material would have been about as close to blasphemous as you could get, but certainly in the later texts that was considered reasonable. And the seventh of these characteristics of Vajrayana practice are these deity identifications that I've talked about. That was part of the practice. That was an essential part of the practice, was identifying yourself with powerful supernatural beings, be they literal deities, conceived as literal deities, I should say, or be they Buddhas or Bodhisattvas. One was supposed to do these ritual identifications in order to gain the power of those beings. And one did them through, again, meditative visualization, also through what are called mudras or hand gestures. And oftentimes you'll see these mudras or hand gestures on sculptures of Buddhas or Bodhisattvas. And these have a meaning within tantric practice. And in fact, the initiate is supposed to make certain mudras while doing these ceremonies in order to inhabit the body of the Buddha, as it were. In order to become a Buddha, one was supposed to make the mudras that were important to that particular Buddha or Bodhisattva or deity. Now, I think we can't overstate, now I've given you 7 characteristics of Vajrayana. I think we can't overstate the difference that Vajrayana had from early Buddhism. And I think there's an instructive paragraph by the early Buddhist scholar Richard Gombrich, which points at this. So I'll read it right now. Gombrich says, "I think we can safely say that for about 1,000 years, Buddhism in India was a religion which could be characterized as antithetical to Tantra, or at least to Shaiva Shakta Tantra, where Shakta Tantra is Tantra of the goddess, Devī, which was the Tantric religion par excellence. Firstly, Buddhism cultivated self-control in general, that is to say in meditation, let's say. In a possessed person, however, normal self-control and self-awareness are totally suppressed. Secondly, Buddhism per se, being unconcerned with worldly matters, did not recognize Brahminical concepts of impurity. That is, any of these impurities, these impure objects or impure fluids that one was supposed to be dealing with that had magical powers, were really just parts of the 4 elements, earth, air, fire, and water. They weren't really any different from any other form. And so within the context of early Buddhism, this was really not important. And in fact, in some of the lists of wrong livelihood that we find recommended for monks, that monks are not supposed to pursue, we find what might be elements here of transgressive practices like these kind of magical, black magic kinds of practices. And again, this is in the context of early Buddhism. And so things change over the centuries. And finally, I'd like to discuss one interesting text called the Tattva Sangraha, or Compendium of Principles, written sometime around the 7th century, where what we see is what we might call a kind of a crystallization of one aspect of Tantric or Vajrayana thought. It is seen as actually superior, and not only superior, but the authentic teaching. So in this particular text, the Tattva Sangraha, the Buddha's life story is reworked so that his awakening occurred because the Buddha actually undertook tantric practices before he became awakened. Basically, the story seems to be that a lot of these practices were secret and perhaps suppressed, but that in fact, this text claims, the Buddha actually did undergo these kinds of initiation rituals and rites in order to become awakened himself. This implies that the tantric practices are essential for awakening. The Buddha himself needed them. It's not simply that the tantric practices are a quick way to awakening, or Vajrayana, of course, I should say Vajrayana means the thunderbolt school, and some people take that to mean that it allows you to become awakened in a thunderbolt as opposed to having to wait thousands of lifetimes. But it's not simply that one obtains awakening quicker by these practices, but at least this text seems to suggest without these practices you simply can't attain awakening at all. And this kind of viewpoint stakes out Vajrayana practice as different from both early Buddhism, Theravada, and Mahayana practice. All of these, it sets itself out as different. It's saying that the Vajrayana practice, the Tantric practice, is the true, authentic practice of the Buddha, and that insofar as we are not undergoing this kind of ritual identification with deities and Buddhas of the past, we're not going to be able to achieve what we want to achieve. And to repeat what I think is really, really important is not everybody, certainly not everybody nowadays takes these things as literal. Most people, I would say, at higher levels within Tibet would probably take them as metaphors of one kind or another and not to be taken literally. Again, within the early texts, they probably were to a degree. They certainly were to a degree. And within the context of Shaiva Tantra, they were also. But one does not have to take them that way. One can simply understand them as powerful psychological practices using at least somewhat forbidden kinds of psychological techniques that could be dangerous in the wrong hands, that need supervision from an accomplished master to do. So I hope that's been useful. If you have any comments or questions, or think I've left something out or misdescribed something, if you've had experience here, I'd love to hear your comments down below, because this is an enormous topic and simply not one that I can get across in a reasonable short video like this. But again, thanks so much for being here. Thanks so much for your kind comments and questions. I always love reading them. And if you're interested in supporting the channel, check out my Patreon page where I'll have material from time to time that I find of interest. And meanwhile, be well.